It seems to me that simulation theory is really an ancient cosmology cloaked in naturalistic language for people who are uncomfortable with spiritual or supernatural things. We'll see if that's really the best explanation for what we see in the world and how we can best describe it. So we're going to start with the Y files here. I think AJ does a really good job of kind of defining simulation theory for us. If you haven't found the Y files yet, get onto that channel. It's awesome. There's a great community over there as well. And then we're going to go into C.S. Lewis and spend most of our time there. We'll come back to the Y files with a conclusion, and we might throw in a few other things if we have time. So stick around to the end.
The idea of the universe being a simulation is not a new one. Theories exist in ancient cultures around the world. Modern simulation theory comes from Nick Bostrom, a philosopher at Oxford who wrote an influential paper on the subject in 2003. Assuming that living in a simulation is possible, Bostrom presents the simulation trilemma, which says one of the following must be true. 1, we destroy ourselves before we're able to create a simulation. 2, we're able to create a simulation but choose not to. Or 3, we are definitely in a simulation. Bostrom believes each of these is equally likely to be true. Now, I don't think that's controversial. We use computer models to study the human population, predict the weather, for entertainment. We simulate everything. And when a civilization can create a realistic simulation, the most obvious one to create is that of its own early existence. Bostrom calls this an ancestral simulation. And a civilization that can do this wouldn't just create one simulation, it would create many. And those simulated civilizations might create their own simulations of the universe, and on like Russian nesting dolls of reality.
Now you're a character in that world and you think you have free will and you say, I want to invent a computer, so you do. Hey, I want to create a world in my computer. And then that world creates a world in its computer. And then you have simulations all the way down.
So that Russian nesting doll thing will come up here in a little while. So keep that in mind, the Russian nesting dolls.
When Elon Musk was asked what he thought the chances were that our reality is the original base reality,
the odds that we're in base reality is 1 in billions.
Neil deGrasse Tyson is a little more conservative. He thinks the odds that we are in base reality versus a simulated reality is 50-50. A 50-50 chance that everything we experience is artificial, that's still pretty high.
Why would it be artificial? So this is my reality. It's real for me. If I'm a part of that reality, then it doesn't mean it's artificial. It means it's just as real as I am. So based off of my perspective, my perception of reality, it is still real, even if supposedly there's this Russian nesting doll thing going on and we're not in base reality. There's a other higher, more real reality out there. I don't think it has to be an illusion or anything like that. I mean, based off of me as an observer, I'm still observing the reality that I exist within. So it's real to some degree.
And even though we mostly hear what scientists think about this, it's not scientific theory. Simulation theory isn't math, it's philosophy. It isn't physics, it's metaphysics. So what we need is hard evidence that we live in a simulation. And to find proof, all you have to do is look.
What kind of evidence are we looking for? And then the question becomes, what is that evidence explaining to us? And I think that if we've removed one of the options, then yeah, all we're left with is some kind of naturalistic explanation of something that I think needs more than just a naturalistic explanation for it. Just like this. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. Do you feel it? Does it feel like we're living in a simulation? How do you best explain the world around it? Because part of the reason that I'm doing this video is that in my podcasts, in my YouTube journey, and even on Twitch, all of those sources of media that I am on, all of them at the same time we're talking about simulation theory. So, and it gives me an excuse to talk about C.S. Lewis. So I was like, okay, I'm listening.
Let's start at the beginning. There was no space or time. The contents of the entire universe were concentrated to the size of a tennis ball and had a temperature of 1 quadrillion degrees. Then suddenly, the Big Bang. everything explodes outward faster than the speed of light. Then about 14 billion years later, we've got galaxies and planets and ice cream and K-pop.
Ice cream, chillin', ice cream.
Yeah, I could do without the K-pop.
Isn't this conjecture? I hear this a lot. Like, all matter is space, or all space and time were compressed into this really small space, small piece of matter. I don't, like, it just feels a little clunky of an explanation. And I realize for some people, the religious explanation feels clunky too, like it might be a cop-out. But it just seemed like there's a lot of conjecture there. Like, okay, before the Big Bang, let me describe the world for you. Okay, well, you could wind the clock back and then assume that you're describing the world accurately, but I think we have to take that with a grain of salt.
Me too. Okay, if before the Big Bang there was no space and no time, what was there? What about the beginning of the universe from the religious point of view? God created everything. Fine. Where was he before? What caused the Big Bang to happen in the first place? What made God decide to snap his fingers or wiggle his nose or whatever he did to make everything happen?
This goes back to your idea of God. What comes into your mind when you think about God is the most important thing about you. And the question of where was God before everything else is kind of a clue that we're thinking about God still in finite terms. God was not anywhere. What was God do? God is infinite and personal. That's the biblical Christian worldview. And being infinite, there is no explanation for God's existence other than himself. He's just sort of, God is. And that might not satisfy some of our maybe modern thinking where we want things to be clearly defined. We're afraid of mystery. But that's the best explanation for God. God is infinite. God is personal. If we take either one of those things away, then we kind of muddle through trying to explain questions like this. Like, where was God before everything? God is infinite. There's no where. God doesn't exist like that. Sorry.
If you ask a physicist to explain what existed before the universe, they'll give you an answer about quantum foam, dark energy, or something just as bonkers as the Big Bang. Ask a theologian what existed before God created the universe, and you'll get an answer equally as confusing. But
Okay, fair point.
what does make sense is that the universe was just sitting there dormant. Then someone somewhere decided to boot up a program. Our program are all the laws of the universe. Electromagnetism and gravitational force are written into the program. The speed of light gets a value. There's code for Planck's constants of mass, speed.
Written into the program, there's code. Great book to read or documentary to look at is called The Privileged
In
Few.
time, Avogadro's number is in there, along with a bunch of other rules that govern the behavior of everything that exists, all part of our program. Even consciousness itself is part of our simulation. If you've never heard of simulation theory, then this might sound far-fetched, but some of the world's most respected scientists, technologists, and philosophers believe that it is more likely than not that we are living in an artificial reality. So, how do we prove it?
Again, I don't like that word artificial. Like, why would it be artificial? Even if it is a simulation and I'm a part of that simulation, then it is as real as I am, and therefore it's real to me, the best way I can explain it. So maybe I'm splitting hairs there, but it's not artificial. It's not an illusion. It is real. It's just the question of how do we describe what that is. Let's get into some C.S. Lewis. So this is Doug Wilson explaining the Ransom trilogy that C.S. Lewis wrote. And I find that some maybe evangelical Christians are shocked to find out what is actually written in the Bible. And that's part of the reason why I'm doing these podcasts is I want to explore those things. I'm not worried about those things. I do come at these questions from a biblical Christian worldview. And I find mysterious things to be fascinating. And so I love that I get to share this with you. If you're at this point in the video and you haven't subscribed yet, I would ask you to subscribe and just be a part of the community, chat. That's what it really is about, is share this with somebody if you already have subscribed. I think that there are a lot of people who benefit from exploring these conversations. And so if you're one of those, I'm glad you're here. If you know people like that, I'm glad that you're sharing this video with them. And so Doug's going to break down sort of C.S. Lewis's approach here to, he doesn't call it simulation theory, but you'll start to pick up on the themes that are repeated.
The Ransom Trilogy is a popularization in modern garb of the medieval cosmology, which in its turn was a restatement of the biblical cosmology. So you have biblical cosmology, a variation on that, which is the medieval cosmology, and Lewis's cosmology is a modern version of the medieval cosmology, which is a version of the biblical cosmology. There are adjustments, there are variations, but it's recognizably the same in all three categories.
Yeah, so not exactly the same, but the medieval cosmology is an outworking of the biblical cosmology. And we have been told in our modern day that we have to reject the ancient cosmology, that, that's outdated, since Copernicus, and we need to get rid of all those crazy ideas. And yet here we are coming up with simulation theory, which, as you will see, is not that much different, I think.
Now, there are many modern believers who hold themselves to be Bible believers, but who would recoil in embarrassment from a straightforward. Now, there are many modern believers who hold themselves to be Bible believers, but who would recoil in embarrassment from a straightforward reading of what the Star of Bethlehem was actually supposed to have done, which is pick out a house in a small town for the wise men to find. How can a star do that? So Bethlehem is about 6 miles away from Jerusalem. The Magi follow the star to Bethlehem, and the text says explicitly that the star singles out a house, points out the house. They found the house where Jesus and the baby Jesus and where Mary and Joseph were because the star showed them the way. Now, either the account is false, some sort of crazy story, mythological legend sort of thing, or the wise men were doing some serious astrology in the dark, high levels of math, trying to figure out, carry the two, no turn left, that sort of thing, which also has its own cosmological implications. So if they were doing serious astrology and they found the house that way, then that has implications. Or a star, in some way, shape, or form, came down into our atmosphere and led the way to the house. In which case, stars are not what we assume them to be. Stars are, at the very least, more than what we generally assume them to be.
Okay. So that story of the birth of Jesus, again, taken for what it is, and just read the Bible for what it is. I know some people will say, well, you could swing the pendulum too far and say none of it's literal. You could swing the pendulum too far and say it's all literal, there's nothing figurative about it. Or you could just take it seriously for what it's saying and then ask this question. Let it lead you to this conclusion that maybe stars are more than what we assume they are. We can explain what a star is naturalistically, and that's true, but is that a full picture of what a star actually is? Because the Bible is telling us that a star came down from heaven and pointed out where Jesus was. And that these wise men doing astronomy and astrology, which are kind of more closely related in ancient times than we would think of them today, figured out what that star was doing, figured out what the stars were doing. You can look at Michael Heiser's video on this. And they knew that the stars, the heavens, were telling something about this birth. And so I think we need to expand our understanding of what things are beyond the natural realm. That doesn't mean we disregard the natural and say, well, since we've explained what a star is, that's the end of the story. It appears that God might have designed stars and other things to be a little bit more than just what the naturalistic world could tell us they are. So I will find that Michael Heiser video and I will put it in the description of this video.
C.S. Lewis is a writer who single-handedly stood against the reductionism of modernity, but he did not do it as an obscurantist, but rather as a highly educated don at Oxford. So he is challenging the modern cosmology, which is to say the modern set of assumptions about the way the world functions, the way the world is put together, and he's challenging them for a reason.
And I think we should as well. I think we should follow suit. I think that we're coming to a place in our time and culture where we're realizing that, I mean, modernity helped us to some degree, but we can't say that it's done everything for us. We have to realize that we need more than that. And I tend to look back into the wisdom of the ancient past. That's kind of my shtick, if you will. That's my bias. But I think that this critique of modernity is very useful. And when I started to understand the connection between modernity and maybe the evangelical Christian movement, it kind of explained a lot of things for me. Stuff that for me, I'm not really interested as far as like, I call it churchianity, which is really lame and maybe cringe, but I'm interested in Christianity. I'm not really interested in churchianity, how we like sort of, how the modern person sort of acts out their Christian faith, I guess. Man, that sounds harsh, but hopefully you understand what I'm saying. I think that this critique is useful within the evangelical sphere of Christianity.
The 1962 version of the New Bible Dictionary put it, quote, the implied angelology of C.S. Lewis's novels, Out of the Silent Planet, etc., would probably have commended itself with some force to the biblical writers. All right, the implied angelology of Lewis's Ransom trilogy, in other words, would probably have commended itself with some force to the biblical writers.
So C.S. Lewis's fictional book probably made more sense to the ancient biblical writers than any sort of modernistic explanation that we now try to have. I do think it's funny in my mind to think back to having a conversation with maybe somebody from 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. And we think we're so smart and we're so advanced and we've done so much. But we would go back in time and they would look at us like we're children, like we're just scratching the surface. And I think this is one of the reasons why the Joe Rogan and Graham Hancock podcasts are really popular. I've found them to be really good because, again, it's kind of challenging that idea that we're at the apex of our human understanding of the world and even ourselves and things like that. All right. And I haven't forgot about the Russian nesting doll illustration. We're getting there. Hang in there.
In other words, they were talking about the same basic thing. Now, we don't want to get this backwards, and some people might get this backwards, believing the Bible because C.S. Lewis said it was okay to believe the Bible. That's backwards. It's important, nevertheless, to note the importance of a man of Lewis's stature showing us many of the places where we may have compromised without knowing it.
Yeah. And I think what he's touching on there is the strange things that we read in the Bible. Like, it's like, oh, well, C.S. Lewis has given us permission to like admit those things that make us uncomfortable about what we believe, or, we believe that the Bible is God's revealed word, and then we read it and we're kind of like, ooh, wait, does it really say that? That it's okay because C.S. Lewis gave us permission. That's not that, we should just be more familiar with the way the Bible is portraying reality than I think we are, and be okay with that view of reality, and realize that, yeah, we've come through kind of this modern push to disregard some of those supernatural things. But I think that is a mistake.
The second thing to note is that Out of the Silent Planet is important and significant because it, along with Perelandra, It, along with Paralandra, sets the stage for That Hideous Strength, one of the most prophetic and important novels written in the 20th century. That Hideous Strength, I think, is important, well-written, gripping, but he says it's a fairy tale for grown-ups. I would prefer to categorize it as a prophetic, a novel-length parable, a prophetic parable.
Yeah. A novel-length prophetic parable. He's talking about the third book in the Ransom trilogy, Out of This Island Planet, Paralandria, and That Hideous Strength. If you have not read That Hideous Strength, now is the time, because I think Doug is exactly right. It is a prophetic work. I think that C.S. Lewis was able to achieve that because of how he understood the world and the forces at work within this world. Here, I'll give you something here. This is value added, free of charge here. So I came upon this tweet. I'm telling it for years now. Once they're totally desperate, they'll launch a fake alien attack to unite humanity under one world government. But C.S. Lewis saw this coming, I think. And so my response is, I'm not convinced that it will be fake, and I'm not convinced that it will be aliens, because I've read this book in which he tells the story of the elites actually uniting with these spiritual forces of darkness to control the population. That's the spooky part of C.S. Lewis's imagination here in this book. But there you go. You can follow Strange Theology on Twitter if you want. I'm not going through this entire lecture by Doug Wilson. I will leave a link to it. It's worth listening to in its entirety because it is really good.
Consider the physical structure of the world. And by world, I mean universe, what we would say universe. This is Lewis from that essay I mentioned, Imagination and Thought. Lewis, I assume that everyone knows, more or less, its material layout. A motionless Earth at the center, transparent spheres revolving around it, of which the lowest, slowest, nearest, and smallest carries the moon, and thence upward in the order Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. Beyond these, all the stars in one sphere. Beyond that, a sphere which carries no light, but merely imparts movement to those below it. That sphere is the clutch. Okay, that's the gear that makes it all go. Beyond that, the Empyrean, the boundary of the mundus, the boundary of the world, the beginning of the infinite, true heaven. Okay, so what you have is a motionless Earth at the center.
Okay, so he's explaining Lewis's vision of the cosmos, okay, which is kind of tied to this medieval vision, which is tied to the biblical, even though there's differentiation along the way.
Have transparent spheres. Now think of it this way. You've got the Earth here, and then around it, we're not talking about a sphere as in a circle. We're talking about a sphere as in a globe. So picture the Earth at the center, and then a goldfish bowl, or one of those glass things that fishermen use in their nets, a little round glass ball. So you have a glass ball that completely encases the Earth. So that would be the Earth at the center, then the glass case, quotation marks around it. And
yeah, and of course, when we went into quote-unquote outer space, we didn't hit this sort of sphere that we, ancient people would have thought about. And so, therefore, we've disproven it, right? And maybe in abandoning that, we've actually lost something of a better explanation. So it's true that there's not this sort of glass, quote-unquote, glass sphere, but is it still true in some other sense that the world does orientate this way? Or that if we can tolerate an explanation of the world orientated this way, that we would actually benefit in our understanding of that world.
And embedded in the wall of the glass is a marble. That marble is the moon. Okay, so you have the Earth, glass sphere surrounding the Earth, and embedded in the side of the glass sphere is a marble called the moon. Then you go one out, you've got, this whole thing is like a Russian doll. All right, so.
Okay, so there it is. I mean, he's describing what Neil deGrasse Tyson described, except, of course, Neil deGrasse Tyson would utterly reject the ancient cosmology of medieval times and beyond. And he's going to have to come up with his own cosmology now. He's going to have to come up with his own way of describing existence, all that is. So what does he do? He uses computer language. And he says, well, if we're in a computer simulation, maybe somebody in that computer simulation invents a computer and then invents a simulation within the simulation. And the whole thing is like Russian nesting dolls. And we have to do that because we've rejected the spiritual reality. So is it true that there's these glass spheres? No, not technically. But is it true that the natural world is all there is? No, I don't think that's a good explanation for reality either. We've disregarded that supernatural dimension, and now we're waffling to try to explain how the world works the way it does if that supernatural dimension doesn't exist. So the modern reductionist attempt to get away from the ancient myths and legends has invented its own nearly identical cosmology, just in naturalistic language, which in a way sounds like another myth and another legend.
So you have these spheres that encase the whole thing, and then embedded in the wall of that sphere is Venus, the planet Venus. Then you go one out and you have the sun, then you have Mars, then you have Jupiter. Okay, here is another quote from Lewis. Go out on any starry night and walk alone for half an hour, resolutely assuming that the pre-Copernican astronomy is true. Look up at the sky with that assumption in your mind. The real difference between living in that universe and living in ours will then, I predict, begin to dawn on you. Okay, so go out, look at a star-spangled night, and try to think like a medieval. When moderns hear about the heavenly spheres, it's easy to assume that the reference is to the planets themselves, to the marble. But it's not to the marble. It's to the thing that carries the marble, the thing that carries the planet. Instead of this, think of the sphere as a great transparent globe surrounding our planet completely. We are at the center of it. And I should say something there. We are not at the center of this thing because we are the most important. That's one of the outrageous slanders on the Middle Ages, that they were geocentric. They did believe in a geocentric solar system, but their geocentricity was not a function of them believing that Earth was the most important. They thought we were the sump pump in the basement. Okay, they thought that we were the lowest place that anybody occupied. That it was central, but it was low. All the action was up in the heavens. All the good stuff was up there. We were lowly, central and lowly, but lowly.
All the action happens up in the heavens. Lewis works this out again in The Great Divorce, where he says that as he's going into that heavenly realm, that we are ghosts by comparison. Our natural bodies become like see-through, translucent, and we can't even pick up flowers because the stuff of heaven is more real than this world that we now occupy, this physical, natural world. This is a little bit earlier on in the video, but I want you to hear this as well, and then go back and we'll watch the whole thing yourself.
What have we done when we fall completely into the trap of outer space? We've identified heaven with hell.
So he's saying when we look at outer space as though it's empty and this vacuous darkness, and yet the ancient people would have looked out into what we call outer space and saw the heavens. They would say that that's the heavenly realm. Now, whether it's actually located out in the sky, so to speak, can be debated.
Outer space, what we call the void, what we think of as the outer darkness. What have we done when we fall completely into the trap of outer space? We've identified heaven with hell. What is hell? It's the outer darkness. Well, the heavens are not
no life.
The heavens are not the outer darkness.
And Lewis worked this out. He tried to get people to understand that the heavenly realm is not devoid of life. This is from another spot in Doug Wilson's lecture. And remember with the Y-Files and AJ, they were talking about how computer programs and there was code and there were laws and it was all written into the simulation. It's like we can't escape the need for language, for revelation. I think this is God's word. God literally spoke existence into being, and so we have that remnant and we see that and we try to explain it. Simulation theory uses like computer code language. There's another way to explain it, though.
Let me just make a parenthetical comment here. This is one of the reasons why advances in microbiology have been so devastating for the Darwinist, so devastating for the materialist. When we study life and you study the cell and you find out that every living cell has DNA in it, what is DNA? It's a vast, complex library full of information. And information is not material. Information is spiritual. And so a library is full of ideas and thoughts and stories and novels and programs and that go beyond the material components of what makes up that physical library. When you come down to the level of DNA, you discover.
So did you notice what he did? He's talking about the natural world, the physical library, but then you have to unpack the ideas that exist within that physical library. So we have the natural and the spiritual. We're not throwing out one for the other. We're saying that the biblical cosmology allows me to see the whole world just the way it is, without rejecting one part or the other.
Library after library after library, full of information, crammed full of information. And not only so, but you have, so on a DNA strand, you have, it codes, the information is coded one way, and then, you know what a palindrome is. A palindrome would be, the first words spoken were a palindrome. Madam, I'm Adam. So if Adam says, Madam, I'm Adam, if you read it this way, it's Madam, I'm Adam, and you read it this way, it's Madam, I'm Adam. So it reads the same way, front and back. Well, suppose you had a language where it said, Madam, I'm Adam, this way, and reading the other way, it was, hello yourself, I'm Eve. Suppose it went this way, one way, and then you had another language going the other way. Or you had War and Peace going this way, and Pride and Prejudice going this way. The complexity of the information, the complexity of the spiritual realities at the base of human life is just absolutely staggering. And the reductionist wants to treat it like it's all just stuff banging into each other, just crazy.
Yeah, the code is written into the fabric of reality. It's language. We see language everywhere. And then the question is, where does language come from? It comes from a person. So we said that God, what comes into our mind when we think about God is the most important thing about us. And if you think of God as not infinite, then you're gonna struggle to answer some of these questions, and you're probably gonna end up in simulation theory. But if you say God is infinite and personal, then we realize, okay, God is infinite in power, but personal in his ability to communicate and use words, use language, and to reveal himself to creation. So there's language everywhere. It's not a coincidence. It's on purpose that in the beginning, Genesis chapter 1, God says, let there be light. In John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word. We can't overlook that. So what Doug is saying is we can't just also then just look at the Word itself in our own experience. I'm talking about books and whatever. But realize that words are even more than just the sort of naturalistic explanation for what words are. There is meaning packed within those words. There is a spiritual reality that is unpacked when you come into contact with those words. So this takes us back to the Star of Bethlehem. I mean, that the star is a star. We're not discounting that, but we're just saying that the star is also more than just how we would explain it in naturalistic terms. That's probably enough, Doug Wilson. Again, check this video out. We're going to go to the Y-Files because I think AJ has a really interesting way of concluding this whole conversation.
Limiting the speed of light is a useful rule to have in place. Quantum mechanics like the double slit experiment and quantum entanglement only make sense if there's a program at work, because only the program can ignore the laws of physics and ignore the concept of time itself. A convenient case for simulation theory is you can't disprove it. The Big Bang, that was the simulation booting up. We haven't found aliens, they're not in the simulation. How come UFOs seem to violate the laws of physics? Well, because they're programs operated by the simulation creators.
Or stars seem to do things that we think stars shouldn't be, and that stars are more than what we can just
They don't
explain.
have to follow the laws of physics.
Yeah, but who created the simulation?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? When you think of the simulation creator as an omniscient intelligence who exists outside of our understanding of space and time, it sounds an awful lot like you're describing God. And just like you can't prove we're not in a simulation, you can't prove there is no God. If something miraculous happens or something horrible happens, you can say it's part of the simulation just as easily as you can say it's part of God's plan. Something I find very interesting is that many believers of simulation theory are fierce atheists. They dismiss the idea of God as corny superstition. And there are plenty of devoutly religious people who dismiss provable science like evolution and the age of the earth. People on the religious side say that if there is no God and life is just a simulation, then nothing matters. Without God to guide us and sometimes punish us, depending on what you believe, our actions don't have consequences. I disagree. Even if we don't live in base reality, we still live in our reality, and our actions here do have consequences. As for what happens after we die, simulation or not, nobody really knows. Both sides argue that faith and science are not compatible. Isn't this hypocritical? Whether you believe in God or you believe in simulation theory, the real question is, what's the difference?
Yeah. And that's where I'm at as well. I hear a lot of people explaining simulation theory, and I'm like, okay, I don't disagree with you. I just define my terms differently. You're talking about the simulation creator. I would just talk about God as a divine creator. But again, we've rejected that as a possible explanation, and then we attempt to explain the world that we see. I think it's really interesting that AJ points out a lot of people who believe simulation theory are fierce atheists. Then they go on and explain something that sounds a lot like God and the creation narrative that we would read in something like the Bible. So, man, interesting stuff. If you are, interesting stuff. What is the difference? Thank you for hanging out with me as I go through this. I really do enjoy chatting with people about these things. And so thanks for being a part of this. I, again, would love to read your comments, hear your thoughts on stuff like this. If you haven't subscribed, subscribe. If you have, share it with somebody. And I will catch you in the next one.